Moving into this neighborhood was supposed to be the perfect start to a quiet life, away from the chaos of city living. But what I hadn't accounted for was the sheer insanity of the HOA and, more specifically, the tyrannical rule of Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the community, who seemed to believe that every single person had to bow to her whims while she lived above the rules that she so aggressively enforced. And this became a personal war the moment she decided that my beautifully cultivated hedge, a lush, vibrant wall of greenery that I had spent years nurturing, was somehow an inconvenience to her, and instead of simply avoiding it like a normal, reasonable human being, she took it upon herself to repeatedly drive over it, flattening sections of it with the front wheels of her oversized SUV, leaving behind crushed branches, torn leaves, and a lingering sense of rage in my chest every single time I stepped outside to witness the destruction. And at first I tried the diplomatic approach, because that's what rational adults do. So I approached her with a polite but firm request, explaining that my hedge was on my property and that I would appreciate it if she could avoid driving over it. But the moment the words left my mouth, I could see the smirk curling at the edges of her lips, a look of absolute condescension as she tilted her sunglasses down just enough to make direct eye contact before responding with the most infuriating sentence I'd ever heard. "Oh, honey, if it's in the way, then maybe you should have planted something more durable." And just like that, she strutted away, her expensive designer heels clicking against the pavement, leaving me standing there with a clenched jaw and a burning need to scream. But I wasn't about to let this go without trying the official route, so I documented the damage, took photos of the tire tracks, and submitted a formal complaint to the HOA, thinking surely they would do something about this blatant act of vandalism. But to my absolute horror, I received a response 2 days later not condemning Karen, but instead warning me about maintaining proper landscaping that does not obstruct common areas, which was complete nonsense, because my hedge was entirely within my property line. And when I confronted the HOA president, a weak-willed man who always seemed to be 3 seconds away from a nervous breakdown, he stammered through some excuse about how Karen had raised concerns about the hedge's placement, and that perhaps I should consider an alternative form of landscaping, which was a ridiculous suggestion considering that the only thing actually damaging anything was her inability to stay on the damn road. But no matter how much I argued, it was clear that the HOA was never going to go against Karen, not when she held so much influence over them, which left me with 2 options: either let her continue to destroy my property, or take matters into my own hands. And while I briefly entertained the idea of installing a camera to catch her in the act, I realized that even with footage, the HOA would likely still find a way to dismiss my claims, because when it came down to it, they weren't interested in fairness or justice. They were interested in protecting their own, and Karen was undoubtedly one of them. So instead, I tried one last direct approach, catching her in the act one afternoon when I happened to be outside watering my lawn, as she once again rolled over the edge of my hedge, and I didn't yell, didn't even raise my voice. I simply walked over, arms crossed, and said, "Karen, this is the last time I'm asking nicely." But instead of responding like a normal person, she let out a laugh, a full-bodied, condescending laugh that echoed down the street before she said, "Sweetie, I don't have time for your little gardening problems. Maybe you should try something a little sturdier next time." And with that, she revved her engine, grinding her tires further into the destroyed greenery before peeling off down the street, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust and gasoline fumes. And in that moment I knew being reasonable wasn't going to work. The HOA wasn't going to help, and Karen had no intention of stopping, which meant that if I wanted to put an end to this once and for all, I was going to have to get creative. And as I stared at the latest wreckage of what was once my carefully cultivated hedge, an idea began to form. Something so perfect, so brilliantly devious, that I could hardly suppress the grin tugging at the corners of my lips, because if Karen wanted to keep playing this game, then she had no idea what was coming next. I spent the next week meticulously planning every single detail of my retaliation, knowing that if I was going to do this, I had to be absolutely certain that it would work perfectly, without any way for Karen or the HOA to pin the blame on me. Because the last thing I needed was for them to turn this around and somehow make me the villain in the story, when I was merely responding to her unchecked entitlement. And so, after conducting thorough research, consulting with a friend who worked in landscaping, and analyzing every possible way to turn my destroyed hedge into a weaponized trap, I finally landed on the perfect idea. Something that would not only protect my property, but would ensure that the next time Karen decided to plow through my hedge like she was off-roading in the wilderness, she would deeply regret ever having crossed me. And the key to this entire operation was simple: reinforcement. Because while Karen clearly had no regard for delicate shrubbery, she would certainly care if her luxury SUV suffered catastrophic damage. And that was precisely what I was aiming for. So I got to work, replacing the ruined hedge with a near-identical row of bushes. Except this time, they were hiding something far more sinister beneath their lush green exterior. An underlying structure of solid steel spikes, carefully embedded into the ground and positioned in such a way that, at a glance, they were completely invisible, appearing as nothing more than a continuation of the soft greenery that Karen had been so used to trampling over. But in reality, they were reinforced with rebar and thick iron rods, designed to shred tires, ruin axles, and ensure that the next time she tried to run them over, she would be left with nothing but regret and a massive repair bill. And the best part? Everything was technically legal, because as far as anyone else was concerned, all I had done was replant my hedge. There was no law against reinforcing it with hidden supports to prevent further damage, and even if the HOA tried to argue otherwise, I had plenty of documented evidence proving that I was simply trying to protect my property from repeated acts of vandalism. But I wasn't about to rely on plausible deniability alone, which was why I took things one step further by installing a discrete motion-activated camera, positioned perfectly to capture every angle of Karen's inevitable downfall, ensuring that the moment she made her fatal mistake, I would have undeniable proof of her reckless behavior. And once everything was set up, I waited, my patience unwavering, knowing that Karen was nothing if not predictable, and sure enough, it wasn't long before she took the bait. Because just 3 days after I finished my modifications, I saw her coming down the street in her usual, holier-than-thou fashion, her oversized sunglasses reflecting the midday sun, as she made absolutely no effort to slow down before swerving straight into my property, expecting to flatten my hedge like she had done countless times before. But this time, she had no idea what was waiting for her beneath that innocent layer of leaves. And the moment her front tires made contact, there was a horrific crunch, followed by a gut-wrenching screech of metal on metal. And before she even had time to process what had just happened, there was an explosive burst as both of her front tires violently popped, sending her car lurching forward at an awkward angle as her undercarriage scraped brutally against the hidden reinforcements, producing a sound so loud that it sent flocks of birds scattering from the trees. And then, as if fate itself had decided to add insult to injury, the sheer impact of the collision triggered her airbags, deploying with such force that she was completely engulfed in a cloud of white fabric. Her screams of shock muffled beneath the rapid hissing of deployed airbags and the agonizing groan of her now crippled vehicle, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence, the entire neighborhood seemingly holding its breath as Karen sat there, stunned and disoriented, trapped inside her wrecked SUV, before the reality of the situation finally set in. And the absolute meltdown that followed was nothing short of spectacular, because as soon as she managed to shove the airbag out of her face, she threw open the driver's side door, practically falling out of the car in her hysteria, her voice rising to an ear-piercing shriek as she took in the ruin of her once pristine luxury vehicle. And that was the moment I stepped outside, casually strolling onto my porch with the most innocent expression I could muster, coffee in hand, as I tilted my head and called out, "Oh no, Karen. What happened? Did you hit something?" And the look she gave me could have melted steel, her entire face contorted with rage as she pointed an accusatory finger in my direction, practically foaming at the mouth as she screamed, You did this. You're going to pay for this, you hear me?" But before I could even respond, several other neighbors had started to gather around, drawn by the commotion, their curious gazes shifting between Karen's wrecked car and the perfectly intact hedge. And that was when the real fun began. because instead of taking her side like she clearly expected, I saw several knowing smirks among the crowd, people whispering to each other, and that was when I realized something absolutely glorious. Karen had made a lot of enemies in this neighborhood, and for the first time, she wasn't the one holding the power, because as much as she wanted to blame me, there was no evidence that I had done anything wrong, no rule that I had broken, and more importantly, there were plenty of witnesses who had seen her reckless behavior firsthand, and just as I had hoped, the situation quickly spiraled completely out of her control, because the more she ranted and raved about how this was sabotage and how she was going to sue everyone involved, the more ridiculous she looked. And when one of the HOA board members finally arrived, a frazzled-looking woman clutching a clipboard like her life depended on it, she took one look at the scene, then at me, then at Karen, before letting out a heavy sigh and rubbing her temples, clearly exhausted by the endless drama that Karen seemed to generate. And when she finally spoke, her tone was firm and unsympathetic as she said, "Karen, this is the third complaint about your reckless driving this month. Maybe instead of blaming others, you should consider staying on the road." And the absolute outrage on Karen's face at that moment was priceless, because for the first time, no one was coming to her defense, and that was when I decided to twist the knife just a little deeper, raising my phone and casually announcing, "By the way, I have everything recorded, just in case anyone wants to review the footage." And the second those words left my mouth, Karen froze, her eyes darting toward my phone, in pure panic, because she knew she had been caught, knew that there was no way to spin this in her favor, knew that the HOA wasn't going to protect her this time, and as the reality of her utter defeat settled in, I watched as her face went through an entire spectrum of emotions: rage, disbelief, humiliation, and finally, resignation. And that was when I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that I had won, because no matter what happened next, Karen's days of unchecked entitlement were officially over. Karen stood frozen, her face shifting through a wild range of emotions: disbelief, anger, and finally, the slow realization that she had absolutely no way to weasel out of this one. The entire neighborhood was watching, some whispering, others openly smirking, because for once, Karen wasn't the one calling the shots. And I knew at that moment that the tide had completely turned against her. She had spent years wielding her self-appointed power as the HOA's personal enforcer, terrorizing homeowners with passive-aggressive letters, unwarranted fines, and a general aura of superiority that made people dread running into her. But now, she was just a woman standing in front of a wrecked SUV, her reputation and car equally totaled, with no one left to protect her. The HOA representative, still pinching the bridge of her nose as though Karen's mere existence was giving her a migraine, let out another exhausted sigh before glancing at me. "You said you have everything recorded?" she asked, her tone void of the usual condescension that HOA members use when addressing non-board members. I nodded, holding up my phone and waving it slightly. Everything, from the moment she drove onto my property to the exact second her car. Well, met reality, Karen screeched in outrage, stepping forward with wild eyes, her perfectly manicured hands balled into fists. "That's illegal. You can't record me without my permission," she shrieked, her voice hitting octaves that probably set off car alarms down the street. I raised an eyebrow. "Actually," I said, keeping my tone painfully polite, "it's perfectly legal to record anything that happens on my own property. And given that you've been trespassing and destroying my hedge for months now, I'd say this footage is pretty relevant." One of the neighbors, an older man who had been on the receiving end of Karen's pettiness more than once, let out a low chuckle. "Guess she didn't think about that before flooring it over someone else's land," he mused, shaking his head. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish, struggling to form a response that wouldn't completely incriminate her. But for once, there was no way out. She knew it, I knew it, and more importantly, the HOA knew it. The woman with the clipboard, who was now clearly trying to distance herself from Karen's disaster, turned back to me with a stiff expression. "Would you be willing to send us a copy of that footage for our records?" she asked. Oh, absolutely, I said, pretending to be helpful, even though I was relishing every second of this. In fact, I'll be happy to send it to Karen's insurance company, too. They'll probably be very interested in how she managed to self-destruct her own vehicle. Karen's face went so red that for a second, I was genuinely concerned she might explode. Why, you can't, she started. But before she could launch into another unhinged rant, the HOA woman cut her off. Karen, she said, her voice sharper than before. Enough. That single word seemed to deflate her. Karen stumbled back a step, her eyes wide with shock. Never, not once, had the HOA ever told her to stop. She had always been the one in charge, the one calling the shots, the one who got the last word. But now, it was over. I wasn't done yet, though. By the way, I added, folding my arms, seeing as this is far from the first time Karen has destroyed my property, I think it's only fair that she covers the cost of repairs. Karen gasped so dramatically that she might as well have been in a soap opera. Me? Pay? For that ridiculous shrubbery? She sputtered. The HOA woman rubbed her temples. He's right, Karen. We have multiple reports of you driving onto his property. If he chooses to file a formal complaint, the HOA would be obligated to step in. Karen's lips trembled. But, you're already personally liable for the damage to your car, I pointed out, barely holding back my smirk. I imagine your insurance company won't be too thrilled when they find out how it happened. That did it. Karen's entire body visibly sagged, the full weight of her downfall crashing over her all at once. She had spent years making other people miserable, but now she was the one with the consequences staring her in the face. The best part? It wasn't even technically revenge. I had just given her enough rope to hang herself. She started, but no words came out. Instead, she spun on her heel, stomped toward her ruined SUV, and slammed the door shut so hard I half expected the airbags to deploy again. Then, with a sickening screech of what was left of her front tires, she crawled away at about 5 miles per hour, leaving behind a trail of fluids leaking from the undercarriage of her once pristine luxury vehicle. The second she was gone, the tension broke. The entire street burst into conversation, some people outright laughing, others whispering things like, she finally got what she deserved, and that was beautiful. One of the older women, Mrs. Calloway, who had been living in the neighborhood long before Karen showed up, approached me with a knowing smile. You planned that, didn't you? She asked, her eyes twinkling with approval. I simply shrugged. I just reinforced my property. If Karen chose to destroy her own car in the process, well, that's hardly my fault, is it? She chuckled. Well, whatever you did, thank you. That woman has made life miserable for years. Maybe now the HOA will finally realize that letting her run wild wasn't such a good idea. She was right. The aftermath of Karen's spectacular failure sent shockwaves through the HOA. With her influence shattered, other homeowners began stepping forward, sharing stories of her past behavior, demanding actual changes. Within a month, the HOA held an emergency vote, officially removing Karen from her position on the board, stripping her of the power she had abused for so long. As for Karen herself, she disappeared from the community soon after, selling her house and vanishing like a disgraced villain at the end of a movie. And my hedge? It flourished. No more tire tracks. No more destroyed branches. Just lush, vibrant greenery, standing tall as a monument to karma finally doing its job. And every morning, as I sipped my coffee on the porch, I would glance over at my perfectly intact hedge and smile, knowing that for the first time in years, my home was finally, truly mine again. And it had never felt better.